He thought he'd left the war behind until a blizzard led him back to his mother's forgotten house, and a German shepherd that remembered him better than he remembered himself. What they uncovered beneath the snow would change everything. Hit like and subscribe if you believe some fires never truly die. The snow fell thick across the Montana mountains, swallowing the highway one curve at a time. The world outside Ethan Cole's truck was nothing but white noise and gray breath. He hadn't spoken for miles. The heater and radio murmured in the background, but all he heard was his own breath and Rex's soft whine. Rex had been with him 5 years longer than anyone since Iraq. The scars on the dog's left leg matched the ones on Ethan's chest, jagged, faded, and still tender on certain nights. The letter sat on the dashboard edges, curled from being read too many times. Mrs. Helen Monroe, also recorded as Margaret Cole after marriage, passed peacefully in her sleep. The property in Coldridge Valley is now yours. He had stared at that line for a long time. His mother, or the closest thing to one, had been the only person who kept writing after he stopped answering. And now she was gone. He had driven through 2 states to reach this valley, and the closer he got, the heavier the air felt, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. Each turn took him deeper into a landscape that seemed untouched by time. Frozen barns, wire fences swallowed by drifts, pine trees bent beneath the weight of silence. Every mile felt like stepping back into the past he'd tried to bury. He rubbed at the scar along his jaw, the one the medics said had almost cost him speech. It didn't matter. These days, he didn't have much to say. Rex shifted suddenly, ears pricking up. Oh, a low growl rumbled from his throat, sharp and short, not fear but warning. "What is it, boy?" Ethan murmured, slowing the truck. The dog stood, muscles taut, eyes fixed on the bridge ahead, a narrow stretch of wooden planks glazed in ice suspended over a ravine that looked like a mouth waiting to swallow the world. Then it happened fast. Rex barked once, loud and fierce, and lunged at the passenger door. Before Ethan could grab the leash, the dog shoved it open and leapt into the snow. Rex Ethan slammed the brakes tires, screaming on the ice. The truck slid sideways, skidding dangerously close to the guardrail before jerking to a stop. His pulse pounded in his ears. He barely had time to step out before a sound cracked through the storm, a sharp, tearing groan. A sheet of ice broke loose from the cliff above, crashing onto the bridge with a thunderous snap. The planks splintered, part of the railing vanished into darkness. If he hadn't stopped, if Rex hadn't jumped, Ethan froze breath clouding in the air. The dog stood a few feet away, her dusted white chest heaving. He was staring back at Ethan with that look again, not wild, not animal, but knowing. "You just saved our damn lives," Ethan whispered, voice trembling despite the cold. Rex gave one short huff and limped back toward him, pressing his nose into Ethan's palm. The warmth of the gesture hit harder than the wind. He knelt down, wrapping an arm around the dog's neck, burying his face in the fur that smelled faintly of rain and earth. "You felt it coming, didn't you?" he murmured. The bridge groaned again behind them, another board falling into the abyss. He turned back toward the truck, staring at the dark outline of the mountain ahead. Somewhere beyond that ridge was the house his mother had left him, the one she had built for kids like him, broken soldiers who never made it all the way home. He had no plan but to drive there, see it once, and sell it. But standing there in the storm, his heart beating against the cold, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for him. When he climbed back into the truck, he caught a glimpse of the rearview mirror, the faintest shape in the snow behind them. A figure, a trick of the light. He blinked, and it was gone. "Let's just get there, buddy," he said, forcing a half-smile. Rex rested his head on the seat again, eyes still watching the dark. As they drove, the wind rose like a voice through the trees, whispering something that sounded almost like words. Ethan shivered but didn't turn down the heater. He didn't want to admit it, but he thought it said keep the fire burning. The storm tapered off just before dawn, leaving behind a stillness that felt older than the mountains themselves. Ethan's truck crept down the narrow slope into the valley, the tires crunching over frozen gravel. The air smelled of pine and smoke carried from somewhere unseen, as if the land itself still remembered fire. Rex sat upright in the passenger seat, ears flicking toward every sound, his breath fogging the window. When the house came into view, Ethan slowed to a stop. It stood at the base of the ridge like a memory carved out of wood and frost. 2 stories of weathered timber windows clouded with dust, the porch sagging under the weight of snow. The wind had erased every footprint around it, yet the roof still held steady, defiant against time. Ethan turned off the ignition but didn't move. For a long moment he just watched. Home, he whispered the word unfamiliar on his tongue. Rex whined softly, leaning closer as if to ask what came next. "Yeah, buddy?" Ethan sighed, reaching for the door handle. "Let's see what's left." The cold hit him as he stepped out. Every sound was amplified, the creak of the gate, the crunch of boots through ice, the quiet rhythm of Rex's paws beside him. When he reached the porch, he paused, brushing snow off the brass door plate. The engraving was faint, but still legible, the Coal Haven. Beneath it, in smaller script, a phrase his mother had loved, "Keep the fire burning." He unlocked the door. The hinges groaned, and stale air met him, soap smoke and faint lavender. It smelled exactly like her. He stood there, motionless, afraid that breathing too deeply would make the scent vanish. Light filtered through the dusty windows. Furniture sat under white sheets like forgotten ghosts. The silence wasn't empty. Rex patted ahead, nose to the ground, tail low but not fearful. "Go on," Ethan murmured. "You know the place better than I do." The dog turned down the hallway, sniffing the corners where the air seemed warmer. Ethan wandered toward the fireplace. The bricks were blackened, the iron grate tilted, but the ashes inside weren't gray. They were deep red, faintly glowing at the edges. His hand froze mid-air. The fire had burned recently, maybe within days. He crouched, touching the soot. It was still warm. "That's impossible," he whispered. Snow had sealed the house tight. No tracks led here. His pulse quickened as Rex barked once, a short, urgent warning. He followed the dog into what had once been his mother's study. The room was dim dust hanging in the sunlight like ash. A rocking chair sat beside the window, a blanket folded neatly across it. On the desk, a stack of yellowed letters tied with twine untouched for years. But it wasn't the letters that caught his eye. Rex was pawing at the floorboards near the rug, whining softly. "What do you got there?" Boy Ethan knelt beside him and lifted the edge of the carpet. Beneath it, the wood was scratched, a loose plank slightly raised. He pried it open with his pocket knife, revealing a small tin box coated in rust. Inside, a handful of objects, an old lighter, a photo of a younger version of his mother surrounded by children, and a dull metal chain tangled in dust. He lifted the chain carefully. It was a dog tag. The letters were faint but readable. Lieutenant H. Monroe. His breath caught. Harold Monroe, his commanding officer, the man who had dragged him out of the blast zone that night in Fallujah, the man whose hand slipped from Ethan's grip seconds before the explosion swallowed them both. Ethan stared at the tag until his vision blurred. How did this get here? His voice trembled. He hadn't spoken that name aloud in years. He turned the tag over. There was a faint smear of something that looked like soot and ash, as if it had been burned before buried. His mind replayed the last night of the war, the fire, the sirens, the smell of metal and sand. The guilt that had lived under his ribs all these years pulsed again, raw and familiar. Rex pressed his head against Ethan's knee, grounding him. Ethan closed his hand around the tag, his pulse hammering against the cold metal. "You shouldn't be here," he murmured, unsure if he meant the tag, the memory, or himself. He pocketed it, stood, and stared around the room. The light flickered as clouds moved past the windows, the brightness fading like a heartbeat. Somewhere, deep in the house, a floorboard creaked. Ethan turned toward the sound, but there was only stillness. The warmth from the fireplace lingered in the air, faint but undeniable. And in that silence, carried on the soft hum of the wind, came a whisper that sounded almost like her voice, low, steady, and impossibly close. "Keep the fire burning." The wind began to howl. Before sunset, a low, rising moan that rattled the window panes and made the porch beams tremble. Ethan had spent most of the afternoon boarding up cracks in the walls, his hands stiff from cold, while Rex kept close pacing near the door every time the gusts surged. By the time night fell, the valley had vanished behind a curtain of white. Snow came heavy and relentless, swallowing the landscape whole. The power flickered twice, then went out completely. Ethan found the lantern his mother had left on the mantel, its glass fogged but intact. The small flame he lit wavered against the cold air, throwing soft gold across the room. "Looks like it's just us again," he murmured, setting the lamp on the table. Rex gave a quiet whine, head tilted, his eyes catching the light like amber. The radio on the shelf hissed with static. No signal, no voices, only the wind, endless and hungry. Ethan tried to read one of the letters he'd found earlier, but the words blurred together. His mind drifted back to the dog tag in his pocket, the faint heat he'd felt in the fireplace ashes. He told himself it was coincidence, nothing more, but the house felt too alive for that. Around midnight, the storm reached its peak. The roof groaned and snow pressed against the windows like a living thing. Ethan sat near the hearth, feeding the fire one log at a time, when Rex suddenly stood. His fur, bristled ears, sharp eyes fixed on the front door. "What is it, boy?" Ethan whispered. Rex didn't move. The only sound was the crackle of the fire in the wind outside until 3 knocks, slow, deliberate. Ethan froze. The sound echoed through the hallway, soft but clear, 3 raps, each deeper than the last. Probably the wind, he said, though he didn't believe it. The dog growled low in his throat. Ethan rose, crossing the floor carefully. The boards creaked beneath his boots. "Hello," he called out. Silence answered. Another gust of wind, another knock. He reached for the doorknob, his breath visible in the air. When he opened it, the storm pushed inward, scattering snow across the floor. No one stood there, only the night. But then he saw them tiny footprints half filled with snow leading away from the porch and vanishing into the white. They were too small for a grown person, a child's. Ethan's pulse quickened. "Stay," he ordered softly, but Rex ignored him, bounding into the storm. Ethan pulled on his coat, grabbed the lantern, and followed. The snow was knee-deep, the wind cutting like glass. He moved slowly, lantern held high. The footprints wove through the trees, shallow and erratic, as if whoever made them had been stumbling. He followed them down a narrow path until the light caught something ahead, a small shape crumpled near a fallen log. "Hey!" Ethan called, his voice nearly lost in the storm. He hurried forward, dropping to his knees beside the figure. A girl no older than 8, wrapped in a coat far too large for her. Her hair was wet with snow, her lips pale, her eyes fluttering open at his touch. "You're all right, you're safe," he said, quickly wrapping his arms around her. Her body was ice cold. Rex pressed close, whining softly, his breath fogging the air. The girl's voice came out thin, almost a whisper. I lost her." "Who?" Ethan asked gently. "My mom. She told me to run when the storm came." "What's her name, Mara?" the girl said, shivering. "She's in the cabin near the river." Ethan looked toward the valley below, but all he could see was snow and shadow. The river was at least a mile out, maybe more, frozen and treacherous in weather like this. "All right," he said, lifting the girl carefully. "We'll get you warm first, then we'll find her." The girl nodded weakly, her head resting against his shoulder. He could feel the faint rhythm of her breath through his coat. As he trudged back toward the house, Rex led the way, barking once when they neared the porch, as if reassuring them that the house still stood. Inside, Ethan set the girl near the fire, rubbing her hands, wrapping her in blankets. She looked around the room, eyes wide as if recognizing something. "This house," she whispered. "It was in my dream. The one with the light." Ethan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. "You've been here before?" The girl shook her head. "No, but Mom said if the fire's still burning, we'll be safe." Outside, the storm roared again, louder this time, pressing against the walls like an unseen force. Ethan turned toward the door where flakes of snow still clung to the wood. The footprints he had followed were already gone, erased by wind. Only one faint mark remained, a handprint, small and perfectly shaped, frozen into the ice near the threshold. And for a long moment Ethan couldn't tell if it belonged to the girl he had found or to someone else entirely. The storm didn't break by morning. It deepened, folding the valley into silence so heavy it felt like the air itself had weight. Ethan stood by the window watching the white blur consume the world. The little girl slept on the couch, her small hand clutching the edge of the blanket, her breathing shallow but steady. Rex lay beside her, his eyes half closed, though Ethan could tell the dog hadn't truly rested. Every few minutes Rex's ears twitched toward the door, listening to the wind that still screamed against the walls. Ethan poured water from the kettle into a cup, the steam rising like ghosts. He didn't want to leave the house, not in weather like this. But the girl's words wouldn't leave his mind. She's in the cabin near the river. Her mother could be out there now, trapped, freezing, or worse. He looked again at the child. She couldn't have walked far on her own. Someone had carried her part of the way. You knew we'd come. Ethan murmured under his breath, a thought strange even to him. He turned back to Rex. We can't wait. The dog stood instantly, tail stiff, ready. Ethan layered on his coat scarf, gloves, and shoved extra matches into his pocket. He checked the flashlight, though its beam barely pierced the falling snow outside. Stay close, he said quietly as they stepped out. The door slammed shut behind them, swallowed by the wind. The cold was immediate, brutal, cutting through every layer of clothing. Snow lashed across his face, each flake sharp as glass. Rex moved, first head down, body low against the wind, his fur already dusted with frost. Ethan followed, boots sinking deep into the drifts. The wind howled through the trees, bending the pines until they creaked. Time blurred. The path that led to the river was gone, buried. He followed instinct, guided more by the faint slope of the land than by sight. His breath came in ragged bursts, clouding the air before freezing against his scarf. After what felt like an hour, his legs burned, his fingers numb despite the gloves. We should have waited, he muttered, though the sound was lost to the storm. Rex barked once, sharp and distant. Ethan caught up, squinting through the snow. They were near the ridge now. He could hear the faint roar of water somewhere below, muffled by ice. Good boy, he said, patting Rex's side. Keep going. The dog pressed forward, leading them down a narrow incline, slick with hidden ice. Ethan's boot slipped once, then again. On the third step, the ground vanished. He fell hard, the world tilting into blur snow sky and silence. He hit the bottom with a jarring thud, the air knocked from his lungs. For a moment he couldn't move, the cold seeped in instantly, soaking through his coat. Rex, he shouted, but the wind swallowed his voice. Then he saw it, the faint outline of the dog at the edge of the drop, barking wildly, snow cascading around him. Ethan tried to climb his hands, slipping on the frozen slope. The ice cracked under his palms, and he slid back down. Exhaustion hit suddenly, each breath slower than the last. The snow was soft, inviting. He thought of the warmth of the fire. He thought of his mother's voice saying, "Keep the fire burning." He closed his eyes. Something heavy landed beside him. A warm weight pressed against his chest, followed by the rough scrape of fur against his face. Rex. The dog had jumped. Ethan tried to protest, but no sound came out. Rex's body covered his, blocking the wind, the dog's breath fast and hot against his cheek. Ethan felt a tremor of warmth seep back into his bones, faint but real. The world narrowed to that fur-warmth heartbeat. He drifted somewhere between sleep and awareness, the storm's roar fading into a hum. When light touched his eyes again, it wasn't sunlight, but the dim gray of dawn filtered through cloud. The wind had eased. Ethan stirred stiff and disoriented and realized Rex was no longer lying across him but sitting upright beside him, panting hard. Snow had gathered in the dog's fur, tinged faintly red near one leg. "Hey," Ethan rasped, pushing himself upright. His limbs were numb but alive. "You saved me again, huh?" He reached out, and that's when he saw it. The small tear along Rex's front paw, blood frozen along the edge. The dog limped slightly, tail low, yet his eyes were steady. Ethan followed the direction Rex looked and saw drag marks in the snow, two deep grooves leading from the edge of the slope to where he lay. The dog had pulled him out. "You did this," Ethan whispered, voice cracking. Rex gave a soft huff, pressing his head against Ethan's shoulder. For a long moment, Ethan just sat there, hand buried in the dog's fur, breathing the faint warmth that lingered between them. Above the sky was a dull gray, the storm still muttering in the distance. He knew they had to move. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the river waited, And maybe if the girl's story was true, someone's still alive. He pushed to his feet, steadying himself. "All right," he said softly, his voice almost swallowed by the wind. "Let's bring her home." He glanced back once toward the valley hidden beneath the snow, where a faint line of smoke still rose from the chimney. The path down to the river was nearly invisible, but Rex moved with certainty, his limp barely slowing him. Ethan followed the dog's lead, the cold cutting into his lungs with every breath. By the time they reached the riverbank, the light had begun to fade, turning the world to shades of silver and blue. The ice cracked softly beneath their boots, the sound carrying into the stillness like a warning. Across the frozen stream stood a small structure, its roof bowed, smoke curling faintly from a crooked chimney. "That must be it," Ethan said quietly. Rex barked once in response, the sound sharp against the wind. They crossed carefully, the ice groaning under their weight until they reached the door. Ethan knocked twice, then again. "Mara," he called, raising his voice above the storm. For a long moment there was nothing. Then the faint sound of movement inside, shuffling a latch turning. The door cracked open just enough for a pale face to appear, eyes wide and frightened. "Who are you?" she asked. "My name's Ethan Cole. Your daughter's safe. She's at my house in the valley." The woman's expression broke into disbelief, then relief so raw it made her shoulders shake. "You found her," she whispered. "Please come in before the wind takes the door." The air was thick with smoke. The small cabin was dim lit by a single lantern that threw weak light against the walls. Ethan's eyes adjusted slowly, and that's when he saw them. Not one person, but 5 more. Men and women wrapped in blankets huddled near a dying fire. Their faces were pale eyes, hollow. "You're not alone," Ethan said softly. The woman Mara nodded. "They've been here for 2 days. The storm came faster than anyone expected." Her voice trembled. "We tried to leave, but one of them fell ill. The road's gone." Ethan crouched near the fire, feeding it a log from the stack by the hearth. "You did what you could. It'll hold for now." He looked around, searching for supplies. That's when he noticed a square outline in the floorboards, half hidden under a rug. "What's down there?" he asked. Mara hesitated. "It was already here when we found the place." Ethan knelt, brushing snow and dust away. A small metal ring was set into the wood. He pulled it, and a wooden hatch lifted with a creak. A wave of cold air rose from below, tinged with the scent of earth and rust. He shone his flashlight down. A narrow set of steps led to a stone chamber no taller than a man. "Anyone been inside?" he asked. One of the men shook his head quickly. "Not since we got here. Feels wrong, like it's waiting for something." Ethan took the lantern and descended carefully, Rex following close behind. The air was still almost heavy. His light swept across the walls, revealing shelves of old supplies, canned food water jugs, folded blankets, and in the center a small wooden crate covered in dust. He brushed it clean, revealing faint words burned into the lid for those who remember. Inside, wrapped in yellowed paper, lay a folded letter. Ethan opened it, the ink faded but legible. This house kept soldiers alive when the world forgot them. The signature below stopped his breath. Helen Monroe, his mother. The same handwriting that had filled every letter she ever sent him overseas. The words echoed in his chest. She had been here, had built these shelters for men like him, for the lost and forgotten. "You knew," he whispered to the air. "You kept saving them even when I couldn't save anyone." He felt a brush at his leg, Rex standing still, staring into the corner where the light didn't reach. Ethan followed the dog's gaze. Against the far wall was an old photograph pinned beneath a rusted nail. It showed a group of soldiers standing beside a military jeep, sand swirling in the background. Ethan leaned closer, the breath catching in his throat. He recognized himself, years younger, uniform, neat before the blast that had ended everything. And next to him, half-crouched a German shepherd with the same amber eyes. Rex barked softly, the sound almost human. Behind him, footsteps echoed on the wooden stairs. One of the older men had followed him down, his face pale in the lantern light. His voice trembled as he spoke. "That dog," he whispered. "It can't be." Ethan turned, startled. "You know him," the man nodded slowly. "My son served in your unit. His K-9 was named Shadow. He died the day your convoy was hit." His gaze moved to Rex, who stood motionless, tail low. "But that dog, it looks just like him." Ethan's mouth went dry. He remembered the explosion, the fire, the smoke, and calling out for Shadow with no answer. "He disappeared that day," Ethan said quietly. "I thought he was gone." The old man stepped closer, tears filling his eyes. Shadow dragged 2 men from the wreck before it went up. My son wrote about it. Said that dog had more courage than most men. His voice broke. He didn't know the dog survived. Ethan knotted his throat too tight for words. Ethan looked down at Rex, whose gaze met his with quiet understanding. The scar on the dog's leg, the one he never could explain at all, fit now. He reached out, pressing a hand to the fur between Rex's ears. "You came back," he whispered almost to himself. The old man nodded, wiping his face. "Seems the good ones always find their way home one way or another." Ethan turned back to the letter, tracing his mother's handwriting with his thumb. The lantern flame flickered shadows moving across the walls like breaths. Above them, the storm raged again, shaking the roof. He pocketed the letter and looked up the stairs where faint light filtered through the cracks. Somewhere above, someone whispered a voice barely audible, yet unmistakable. It was a woman's voice, low and calm. "Keep the fire burning." By morning, the storm had softened into a steady hush, the kind that made every sound seem fragile. Ethan stood outside the cabin, his breath clouding in the brittle air. The world was white and clean again, as if the violence of the night before had been erased. Yet nothing inside him felt lighter. The letter from the cellar still burned in his pocket, its words looping endlessly in his mind. This house kept soldiers alive when the world forgot them. Helen Monroe, his mother, her name written in the same slanted script that had once signed birthday cards, grocery lists, and prayers sent overseas. She had been saving men like him long before he knew he would need saving himself. Mara and the others were safe for now. The fire inside the cabin glowed faintly, and Ethan promised to return after checking the valley road. But as he climbed the hill back toward the house, something in his chest grew heavier, a weight that felt older than guilt. He had thought he knew everything about his mother's kindness, her quiet strength. He never realized how much of it had been built on loss. The house came into view again, its roof glistening under the sun, the chimney trailing a thin ribbon of smoke. It looked almost peaceful, though the memories inside still hummed like restless ghosts. Rex trotted ahead, the limp in his step more pronounced, but his tail high. "You should rest," Ethan called, softly, though he knew the dog wouldn't listen. Inside the house smelled faintly of cedar and ash. Ethan set his gloves by the fire and reached for the bundle of letters he had found earlier. Beneath them was a small notebook, its cover cracked and edges worn smooth. He opened it carefully, the pages brittle with age. The first line made his throat tighten. "To my son, if you ever find this, it means I couldn't tell you myself." The handwriting wavered in places ink smudged by what might have been tears. He read on each word a quiet ache. "I know you blame yourself for the ones you couldn't save, but grief, Ethan, is not a punishment. It's proof you tried. When your father didn't come back, I built this house so others would have somewhere to heal. It wasn't about saving everyone, it was about keeping the fire alive even when the world turned cold. If you're reading this, promise me one thing: don't let that fire die. It's the only thing that keeps us human." He stopped there. His hands trembled. For the first time in years, his body gave in before his will. His shoulders shook, and a quiet sob escaped him. He pressed the notebook to his chest, eyes closed. It felt as though the years of silence, the numbness he had carried since the war, cracked open all at once. Rex came to him, resting his head on Ethan's knee, eyes steady and full of something wordless. Ethan reached down, his fingers brushing the dog's fur. "She never stopped trying," he whispered. "Even when I did." Outside, the wind sighed softly. After a long while, he wiped his face, folded the notebook, and placed it back on the table. That was when he heard it, the faint scrape of paws in the next room. Rex had wandered into the hallway, nails clicking against the floorboards. then a sound, gentle but distinct scratching. Ethan followed, puzzled. "What are you doing, boy?" Rex stopped near the old rocking chair, nose pressed to the floor. He dug, carefully clawing at the edge of a loose board. Ethan knelt beside him, pulling it up. Beneath the plank was a shallow space filled with dust and a small wooden box. He lifted it out. The hinges were rusted but still held. Inside lay a single photograph. Edges curled, its colors faded to sepia. Ethan turned it over and froze. It was a picture of his mother standing in front of this very house, her hair tied back, her face soft with the faintest smile. In her arms was a German Shepherd puppy, ears 2 big paws, clumsy fur light around the muzzle. A tag hung from the dog's collar, barely visible in the image. Ethan tilted it toward the light. The letters on it were faint but familiar Rex. On the back in his mother's hand a note read, "Rex on foundation of the line." Ethan exhaled, understanding at last that the dog beside him was a grandson in that line named Rex III in her ledger. "That's not possible," he whispered. The photo felt warm in his hand. He had never seen it before, yet it was proof that his mother had known the dog long before he ever did. He traced the curve of her fingers around the puppy's neck, the tenderness in her eyes. "You knew each other," he said, softly, voice trembling. "You raised him." Rex sat quietly beside him, tail brushing against the floor, eyes fixed on the photo as if he too remembered. Ethan closed his eyes, the pieces aligning in a way that both hurt and healed. His mother had loved this dog, trusted it enough to send it into service. The same dog had found him years later on the battlefield when he'd thought he was alone. None of it could be coincidence. He looked again at the puppy in the photo and then at the dog before him, older, scarred, but still watching him with the same loyalty. "You came back," he murmured, his throat tight. "You came back to finish what she started." The lantern flickered once. For a heartbeat it lit his mother's face as if she were smiling again. Outside, the wind shifted and the faint sound of snow sliding from the roof echoed through the valley like a sigh. Ethan sat in the half-light holding the photograph to his chest, the weight of it both unbearable and comforting. Somewhere, deep inside the walls, the house creaked gently, a sound like breath, steady and alive. The morning after the storm broke clean and bright, the kind of winter morning that looked peaceful from a distance but still bit hard when you stepped into it. Ethan stood on the porch, the photograph of his mother and Rex tucked safely in his jacket pocket. The valley stretched below, blanketed in sunlight, and for the first time the air smelled less of loss and more of promise. Inside, the fire still burned quietly as though it too refused to die. Mara and the others had made it back to the main house at dawn. Their faces were pale, but they were alive, their relief so raw it made Ethan's chest ache. They had brought what little food they could salvage, and together they cleaned, patched, and warmed every corner of the place. He found himself giving orders again, not like a soldier commanding a field, but like a man rebuilding something worth saving. "We'll start with the roof," he told the 2 younger men as he handed them tools. "The worst of the storm's past, but the next one won't be so forgiving." They nodded wordlessly. For the first time in years, people listened to him without fear. Rex followed him room to room, his limp easing as he moved. When the day wore thin, Ethan sat by the hearth, notebook open, writing in the margins of his mother's old letters. "You were right," he murmured aloud as he wrote. "You kept the fire alive. I'll do the same." It wasn't a vow made of grand gestures, but of quiet steadiness. Every board fixed, every nail driven, felt like another heartbeat added back to the house. By the 3rd day, the valley lay quiet under the pale sun. Still, a heaviness lingered in the air. Ethan couldn't explain it, but something in the silence didn't feel finished. Early that afternoon, while checking the perimeter for fallen branches, Rex froze, head tilted toward the ridge to the east. The dog barked once sharp and insistent before taking off into the trees. "Rex," Ethan called, but the animal didn't stop. He grabbed his coat and followed, crunching through the snow. The trail wound deeper into the forest branches, heavy with frost, the sky dimming to steel gray. Rex's paw prints carved a clean path through the drifts. The dog moved with purpose, not panic. Ethan trusted that instinct by now. It had saved him more than once. They climbed for nearly an hour before he heard it, faint at first, then unmistakable, a distant hum, mechanical, broken. He stopped listening. It came again, stuttering like a wounded heartbeat. A helicopter, or what was left of one. He pushed forward, cresting the rise to find a mangled shape of metal buried halfway into the snowbank. Smoke coiled from the wreckage, dark against the white sky. Rex barked and darted ahead, weaving between twisted blades and shattered glass. "Easy, boy," Ethan shouted, pulling his scarf tighter as he approached. The smell of fuel burned in his throat. A voice, hoarse and barely audible, called from inside the wreck. "Help here." Ethan dropped to his knees, peering through the cracked fuselage. A man in an orange flight suit lay pinned beneath a piece of the cockpit frame, his leg trapped at an unnatural angle. "Don't move," Ethan said quickly. "I'm going to get you out." The pilot tried to nod, his breath coming in ragged bursts. Thought, "Nobody was left out here," he rasped. "You're lucky," Ethan muttered, gripping the metal edge. "My dog's got a habit of finding the impossible." Rex circled the wreckage, barking sharply. The sound echoed warning. Ethan looked up in time to see a tremor ripple through the ridge above them. A groaning crack, the sound of shifting weight. "Avalanche," he breathed. The pilot's eyes widened. "Run?" Ethan grabbed Rex's collar. The dog tugged toward the north, pulling with surprising strength. "You trust him?" the pilot gasped. "With my life," Ethan said, following Rex without hesitation. They veered sharply off the trail through the trees. Behind them, the slope gave way with a roar, burying the path in seconds. Ice and wind slammed into Ethan's back, but Rex led them through a narrow cut between rocks, sheltered from the worst of it. When the sound faded, the world was still again. The crash site was gone, buried under tons of snow. The pilot stared, disbelief painted across his face. "You'd have been dead if we'd stayed," Ethan said, catching his breath. He knew the pilot, whispered, looking at Rex. The dog stood at the edge of the ridge, for bristled eyes fixed on the horizon as if scanning for something unseen. "He's done this before," Ethan replied quietly. "He's been saving people his whole life." They made their way back to the valley, slowly, the sky bleeding into dusk. The pilot leaned against Ethan for balance, his injured leg bound in a makeshift splint. When they reached the house, the others rushed to help, their faces lit by the warm glow spilling from the windows. Ethan paused on the porch, watching them. He had seen many rescues in his lifetime, most ending in silence, but this one felt different. This one felt like a promise kept. Inside, the fire crackled softly, steady as a heartbeat. Rex lay near it, eyes closing as if at peace, while the storm clouds gathered once more over the mountains. Ethan turned toward the window, his reflection merging with the night outside. Somewhere in the dark, a whisper drifted through the wind again, familiar, gentle, and full of memory. "Keep the fire burning." The days that followed moved like a low breath, each sunrise softer than the one before. The storm had passed, and the house had become a refuge. Smoke curled steadily from the chimney, and voices, real ones, filled the rooms once haunted by silence. The rescued pilot, whose name was Mark Hansen, rested in the small room near the fireplace, his leg bound and splinted. Mara had taken to cooking again, her daughter never leaving her side. The older man, the one who had recognized Rex, spent his mornings chopping wood, humming a tune that sounded like something out of another time. There was warmth again, not just from the fire, but from presence, from breath, from proof of life. Ethan should have felt peace, but instead there was a restlessness gnawing beneath his ribs. Every time he looked at the valley road, stretching toward the horizon, part of him wanted to follow it, to return to the world beyond snow and memory. He'd told himself that staying was only temporary, a duty to the living. But that night, as the sun dipped behind the ridge and the air turned sharp, something in the quiet changed. The laughter came first faint, high-pitched, unmistakably a child's, though every living child in the house slept upstairs. It drifted through the hallway, light and fleeting. Rex lifted his head from the hearth, ears pricked, tail still. Ethan froze. "You heard that, didn't you?" he whispered. The dog gave a low whine, staring toward the kitchen doorway. The sound came again clearer this time, echoing down from below. A single giggle soft as wind chimes. Ethan knew the sound didn't come from upstairs. In this house, some echoes belonged to the keeper who never left. Ethan's pulse quickened. He reached for the lantern, its glass still warm from the fire, and stepped toward the basement door. The hinges creaked, long and tired. Cold air spilled out, brushing against his skin like breath. "Hello?" He called, his voice low but steady. No answer. Only the faint smell of oil and dust. He descended slowly, Rex at his heel, each step groaning under his weight. When his boots reached the stone floor, the lantern flickered once, then flared brighter, though he hadn't touched the flame. He frowned, holding it higher. The air shimmered faintly, and in the far corner of the cellar the old oil lamp, the one that had been dark for decades, sputtered to life on its own. A thin, steady flame rose, casting golden light across the walls. Ethan's breath caught as he saw it, the writing carved into the stone lines, faint but unmistakable. "As long as the fire burns, you're never alone." The words glowed faintly in the lamplight as though freshly cut. He stepped closer, fingers tracing the grooves. The stone was cold, yet his skin tingled where it touched. "Mom," he whispered, barely audible. The lamp flickered a small flame, bending toward him as if answering. A soft wind passed through the cellar, carrying with it a whisper too gentle to be real, yet clear enough to freeze him in place. "Keep the fire burning." Ethan's eyes stung. He had heard that voice before, not just in this house, but years ago, far away, in places where no one should have survived. In the desert under fire. In the field hospital where the screams never stopped. That same calm tone speaking inside his mind when he was sure he couldn't go on. He had thought it was madness, the echo of trauma, a trick his mind played to keep him from slipping into the dark. Now, hearing it again, he knew better. It wasn't madness. It was memory. It was her. He sank to one knee, the lantern trembling in his hand. "You were there," he said softly, "all this time." The silence that followed was thick with something ancient and kind. Rex pressed close against him, his warmth grounding. Ethan reached to scratch behind the dog's ear, his fingers brushing the scar where fur never grew back. "You found me again," he murmured. "Just like she did." The oil lamp's light wavered, and for a heartbeat he thought he saw a figure reflected in the glass, not fully formed, just a shimmer, a suggestion of a woman standing beside the flame. Her shape was familiar, her hand tracing the writing on the wall. His breath hitched. "Mom," he said again, the word breaking somewhere between grief and awe. The air shifted, and though the figure faded, the warmth in the room deepened. He could feel it in his chest, spreading steady alive. The same warmth that had saved him in the snow, the same warmth Rex had carried through every storm, the same fire she had lit long before he was born. He wiped his face with the back of his sleeve, forcing a shaky laugh. "I thought I was keeping this place alive," he whispered. "But maybe it was keeping me." The lantern flame steadied, burning clean and tall, its reflection dancing across the carved words. For the first time, Ethan didn't feel haunted by this house or its history. He felt held by it. Upstairs, a log cracked in the fire, sending sparks spiraling up the chimney. The sound reminded him of laughter again, faint, distant, but no longer frightening. He stood there for a long time, eyes closed, listening. And somewhere beneath the hum of the storm returning over the ridge, he heard her voice once more, softer than breath, closer than memory. "You're not alone, my boy. Not as long as the fire burns." Spring came quietly to the valley, melting the last of the snow and revealing the bones of a world reborn. For the first time in years, the house no longer groaned under the weight of storms, but stood firm against the wind, its windows clear, its walls mended by steady hands. Ethan moved through each room like a caretaker of something sacred. The fireplace, once cracked and blackened, now burned clean. The porch that had nearly collapsed was rebuilt, its wood still smelling of pine. The garden, buried for decades, had begun to breathe again under thawing soil. What had once been a place of ghosts was now filled with life. Rex followed him everywhere, no longer limping, his fur glinting gold beneath the morning sun. Word had spread slowly at first about the veteran who stayed behind in the mountains. and opened his doors to anyone the world had left behind. A drifter showed up first, then a mother with 2 children, then a group of aging veterans who had heard whispers of warmth where no warmth should be. They brought blankets, old photographs, and pieces of themselves they thought lost. Ethan never asked questions. He only kept the fire burning. They named it together the Hearth of the Lost. The name came to him one night while watching the embers pulse in the dark, each one like a heartbeat refusing to stop. It wasn't a charity or an organization. It was a promise, one his mother had started and he now carried forward. When summer came, he took the old truck into town to file the paperwork for official registration. The woman at the county office, kind but weary, flipped through the forms and frowned slightly. "You're filing for the Monroe property?" she asked. "Yes. The deed has always been under the Monroe Trust. Margaret Cole was the executor and guardian." Ethan nodded. "That's right." She hesitated. "You do know this land was marked for redevelopment a few years ago. A tourist station, something about ski routes and eco-lodges, got stalled after the storm." The words hit like a quiet echo. "They wanted to tear it down?" he asked. "They still might," she said, "unless there's historical value." Her eyes lifted from the form. "You have any proof this place matters?" Ethan smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I think I can find some." 2 weeks later, an inspector came. The man arrived in a government-issued truck, Boots' spotless clipboard tucked under his arm. He stepped onto the porch, glancing around with an air of polite indifference. "Mr. Cole," he greeted. "I hear about your application. Place looks sturdy." Ethan nodded, standing with quiet patience. "It's more than sturdy," he said. "It's home." The man walked through the halls, checking walls, jotting notes. When he entered the main room, he paused by the mantel. There, framed beneath the clean glass, was the photograph Ethan had found buried in the floor, his mother smiling softly, holding a small German Shepherd pup in her arms. The inspector froze. His hand, which had been steady all morning, began to tremble. "Where did you get this?" he asked. Ethan looked at him curiously. "It belonged to my mother," he said. "Her name was Helen Monroe." The man's throat worked silently before he spoke. "Helen Monroe," he repeated almost to himself. She saved my father." Ethan frowned, unsure if he had heard correctly. The inspector set the clipboard down, his eyes fixed on the photo. "My father served in the Pacific. He was found half dead after the armistice, malnourished, broken. A nurse took him in when no one else would, nursed him back to life. Her name was Helen Monroe." He swallowed hard emotion, cracking through his voice. "I never met her, but my father told me she was the reason he ever came home." Ethan felt his chest tighten. The inspector took a slow breath and looked around the room, the walls glowing softly in the afternoon light. "You said this was her house, yes," Ethan said quietly. "She built it as a refuge. I'm just keeping it alive." For a moment the man said nothing. Then he nodded once firmly, as if making a decision that carried more weight than his title allowed. "Then it stays," he said. "I'll file for immediate historical designation and freeze the redevelopment docket. Until review is complete, this property is protected." He scribbled something on the form, signed it with a firm stroke, and slipped it back into his folder. As he turned to leave, he paused by the doorway, glancing down at Rex, who sat watching him silently. "My father had a dog like that," he said softly. "Said it followed him home from the war. Never left his side." Ethan smiled faintly. "Maybe some things are meant to find their way back," he said. The inspector nodded, eyes glistening before stepping off the porch. He said he'd return with the official seal once the paperwork cleared. The sound of his truck faded into the distance, leaving behind the steady crackle of the fire inside. Ethan stood there for a long time, the papers still in his hand, the valley stretching wide and open before him. Inside, voices drifted through the room's laughter, quiet conversation, the hum of a life rebuilding itself. Rex lay by the hearth, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed as if finally at peace. Ethan looked up at the photograph again and felt the warmth of it, not just in memory but in presence. "We did it, Mom," he whispered. "The fire's still burning. Outside, the first snowflakes of early winter began to fall again, soft and slow like blessings returning home. The thaw came slow that year. But when it did, the sound of dripping water filled the air steady, rhythmic, like a heartbeat returning after a long silence. The snow retreated down the slopes, revealing the first threads of green. The river, once frozen and still, began to move again, whispering through its narrow bends. Ethan stood on the porch one morning, coffee in hand, watching the light creep across the valley. The house behind him was alive with quiet motion. Someone chopping vegetables in the kitchen, a radio murmuring an old tune, the laughter of Mara's daughter echoing from the hallway. Every sound felt earned. Inside, the fire still burned soft and constant. He had learned not to let it die, not even at night. It was more than heat now. It was ritual, his mother's heartbeat living through flame. On the table beside the hearth lay his journal, its pages filled with uneven handwriting. That morning he opened to the last page and wrote carefully the words slow but steady. The fire isn't just warmth, it's memory, it's proof that love outlasts everything that tries to silence it. He paused, smiled faintly, and added one more line beneath. And memory, when shared, becomes light. He set the pen down and turned toward Rex, who was lying near the hearth. The dog's muzzle had grown whiter, but his eyes still held that deep, steady glow that had carried them through storms. "You kept me alive, buddy," Ethan said softly, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. More than once. Rex thumped his tail in lazy agreement, then stretched yawning before padding toward the corner of the room where an old blanket had been spread. Ethan followed with his eyes, realizing something he hadn't noticed before the blanket moved slightly, a small soft motion beneath it. He crouched, lifted the edge, and laughed a quiet, breathless sound. Nestled there were 3 tiny pups, all pale gold and trembling, their eyes still sealed. Rex circled them protectively, then lay down beside the bundle with a sigh. "So, that's where you've been sneaking off to," Ethan murmured wonder in his voice. The mother of the litter, a shepherd from the local rescue unit, had been staying at the house for weeks. They must have found each other in the quiet moments between storms. Weeks had passed since the snow first began to melt, enough time for life to start again. Ethan reached out, touching one of the pups gently. "New guardians," he whispered. "Guess you're passing on the mission." Rex gave a soft huff, closing his eyes. The room seemed to glow warmer. Later that afternoon, a truck rumbled up the drive, tires crunching over gravel still wet from melting snow. Ethan stepped outside, wiping his hands on his jacket. A young man climbed out his uniform jacket, faded his posture too straight to be civilian. His face carried the weight of something familiar, that quiet alertness soldiers never truly lose. "You must be Sergeant Cole," the young man said, extending a hand. Ethan hesitated, then shook it firmly. "Used to be," he said. "Call me Ethan." The soldier smiled faintly, then looked past him toward the porch where Rex had appeared, standing tall despite the years. The young man's eyes widened. "That dog," he said softly. "That's him." Ethan frowned. "You've met him before." The soldier nodded slowly. "In Iraq. I was pinned after the convoy explosion outside Fallujah. Smoke, sand, everything burning. I thought it was over." His voice trembled slightly. "Then he came. Out of nowhere. Pulled me out of the wreck. I never saw his handler. Thought he was gone too." His gaze softened. "Guess I was wrong." Ethan stood silent for a long moment, the wind tugging gently at his coat. "You were the one," he said quietly. "You're why he ran back into the fire that day." The young man reached into his pocket and pulled out a small worn badge, a military insignia dulled by time and sand. "He earned this more than any of us," the soldier said, kneeling to place it gently on the porch beside Rex. "And so did you, Sergeant. You both did." Rex sniffed the metal, then looked up at Ethan with calm eyes. Ethan picked up the badge, its weight solid, familiar, almost sacred. He turned it over in his palm, then placed it on the mantel beside the old photograph of his mother. "Thank you," he said softly. The young soldier nodded, once his expression full of quiet reverence. "No," he said. "Thank you for keeping the fire alive." As the man's truck disappeared down the winding road, Ethan stood for a long time on the porch, the air crisp and clear. From the chimney, a thin line of smoke rose straight into the sky, unbroken, steady, like a prayer carried upward. Behind him, the house breathed softly alive with laughter and life. Rex settled near the hearth again, his pups nestled close the fire, painting their fur in gold. Ethan smiled, his voice barely a whisper. "We did it, Mom. It's still burning." Outside, the wind moved through the valley. Not cold this time, but warm, like hands brushing away the last remnants of winter. The sky opened, wide sunlight spilling across the mountains, and for a fleeting moment, Ethan could almost see her there in the brightness, smiling as she once had, watching over the house that never let the light die. If this story moved, you hit like and subscribe to keep the fire burning with us. Tell me in the comments where you watching from and which moment stayed in your heart the longest.